664-bit Windows gets almost 4 times the score of 32-bit Windows. This is absolutely insane. When I look back at these numbers, you know that at those times, we had to go install something on your computer, and you sometimes see the option to install either a 64-bit or 32-bit version. Well, today we're going to be checking if these two options differ in performance. So, from the outside, these two laptops might seem like the same two ordinary Windows laptops, but in reality, they both run different architectures. On the left is the 32-bit version of Windows 7, and on the right is the 64-bit version. Well, this inconspicuous change affects performance. Well, we're about to find out. So while the startup test is playing out, I wanted to point out a couple of things. Firstly, the reason why I'm using Windows 7 and not, let's say, Windows 10 is because the 32 version of Windows 10 has virtually zero program compatibility, so I had to switch to an older OS, and as usual these are both on the same exact hardware like all my previous tests, but I am aware that the 32-bit version of Windows 7 can only use 4 GB of RAM, so I made sure to limit the amount of RAM used in this 64-bit version as well. Now, even though we all know that 64-bit software is superior in every regard nowadays, I wanted to see how much of a difference it made on performance compared to a 32-bit OS, if there even is one. So back to the startup test. I know startup isn't everything, but I always found it as the most interesting test in any comparison because, well, it's where it loads up all the system resources, and it could give us a broad idea of what to expect. So off the bat, the 64-bit version of Windows does win the startup test, and it wasn't by a second or two, it was by a mere 7 to 8 second time period, and I can't say for sure, but I imagine that with more programs and files on the computer, the difference could be even bigger. Following the startup test, I wanted to see how much storage was being used up on both of these laptops, and honestly, this was the result I was expecting. In this case, older technology takes up less storage. So if you're looking for an operating system that takes up less storage, make sure to get a 32-bit operating system. Okay, just kidding, don't actually do that, but still there's an interesting win for 32-bit Windows. Next up is RAM management, both capped at 4 GB to make it fair, and the first thing I wanted to do was a Chrome test to see how many tabs it takes for both of these to reach 3 GB, and honestly not too much of a difference. Surprisingly, 32-bit Windows beat out 64-bit, but only marginally by 2 tabs, and another expected result. So while both laptops are idle and not doing anything other than having Task Manager open, the 32-bit version of Windows took up less RAM than the 64-bit version, I'd assume because 32-bit Windows takes up less system resources. To start CPU management, I want to check what percentage of the CPU is being used up in Task Manager when the OS was doing nothing, and you have really nothing to report here. I usually add this test to see if anything significant happens in the background while the OS is running, but not this time unfortunately. But something that is actually significant is the heat of the CPU. So after observing the lowest temperature of the CPU while nothing was happening in the background, the temperature difference between both laptops is actually very large. 64-bit Windows winning by a 7-degree difference, which was something I definitely wasn't expecting, and the same can be said while both CPUs were at their highest temperatures under a stress test, albeit the difference was much smaller. And here's another one of my favorite yet more difficult tests to conduct, the battery test. And as usual, I have a variety of different applications open in the background to drain the battery, including office applications, websites, videos, etc., and I came into this test with absolutely no expectations because on one hand you have an architecture that is more modern, but on the other hand you have one that is older and takes up less hardware resources, and I was really curious to see what the results were in the end, which is why I find these videos interesting to make, even if filming and editing can be a big pain. But anyways, I'm just going to cut the video since this doesn't drag on for too long, and we can finally see that the 32-bit version of Windows finally shuts off, but moments later, keeping in mind that the uncut footage you see is being sped up by 40 times, 64-bit Windows decides to give up as well, and it won by a 4 to 5 minute margin. Moving on to the Wi-Fi speed test, like usual, I did a trial of 10 tests on speedtest.com and picked the highest download and upload scores for both laptops, and for the download speed, 64-bit Windows wins by about 6 megabytes per second. I'm not entirely sure why this is the case because I'm not aware of anything that 64-bit technology has that would give it the upper hand Wi-Fi speed, but what's even funnier is that in upload speed it does even better this time, beating out 32-bit Windows by 8 megabytes per second. So something fishy is going on and I don't know what it is, and to see how loading times compare on both OSs, I opened a bunch of applications at the same time on both, starting off the control panel and 64-bit Windows. Loads it up first while 32-bit Windows needs a moment or two to load up the icons. Now I did speed up the rest of this, so we don't sit around waiting for the applications to load. But next I tested a series of Office 2016 applications, starting off with Word. As you can see, 64-bit Windows managed to beat out 32-bit Windows, and there's actually quite a large delay in between, which is kind of concerning. Next was PowerPoint, and it was the same exact deal. 64-bit Windows loaded up. First of all, there was a pretty large gap in between while waiting for 32-bit Windows to load up, and remember that these are the same files and programs being loaded up on both of these laptops, edited to the millisecond. So I could be as accurate as possible, and the final Office application I tested was Excel, and surprise, surprise, it was the exact same deal. Once again, the application loaded up first on the 64-bit version of Windows and loaded up dead last on the 32-bit version with a large delay in between. I don't know if this is Microsoft purposely trying to slow down the application so that people would ditch their older computers, but I mean, what you just saw was 3 applications opened up at the exact same time with the same exact results, and the final thing I wanted to open was a PDF file on both of these. And even though 64-bit Windows did win once again, at least the time difference between both laptops was much smaller, I think. Next time when I do something like this, I'll probably choose applications with more variety in terms of what they do, because I mean, we just opened 3 Office applications, so kind of my fault. So moving away from application opening, I did render a pretty simple audio project in Audacity, and both 64-bit Windows was like blazing fast, and it completely rendered the entire audio project by about 2 or 3 times the speed of 32-bit Windows. Now for something like audio editing where it's not as heavy as, let's say, video editing, I was quite surprised by this result. I mean, audio editing, at least in my case, is not very heavy on the CPU or the GPU. Speaking of video editing, let's move on to video editing. So using a video editor called VSDC Video Editor, how many times did I create a 1080p 30 frames per second video project? The laptops will both be rendering about a 2.5 to 3 minute video of some music and video put together. So which one was faster? Well, 64-bit, of course, man. I'm so surprised it went by about 30 to 40 seconds, keeping in mind that the footage you see is being sped up by 6 times the original speed. I wouldn't say it completely destroyed 32-bit Windows, but still, it did a decent bit better. And here's a quick web page loading test of youtube.com. Remember, this is a web-based test, so no CPU or GPU loads on this one. And really, I didn't expect one to destroy another in this test. Even though 64-bit Windows did better than 32-bit Windows, they were so close that I doubt a different architecture affected speed. So let's just move on. Next on the list is transferring a file from a USB to the laptops themselves, and I'm just going to cut this short. 64-bit Windows won, but only by 6 seconds, considering that this is not sped up footage, so this test doesn't really signify anything. A 6-second difference doesn't really mean anything in the real world. If I did the test again, there probably would have been a chance where 32-bit Windows beats out 64-bit Windows. There's always % error in all these tests. And last test before we get into the benchmarks is the virus scan test. Again, sped up footage, but in terms of scanning speed, unlike file transfer, 64-bit Windows did way better than 32-bit Windows, and not by just like a mere 6 seconds. Rather 40 seconds. So wow, there's a result I wasn't expecting. And finally, we're on to the benchmark. So now, first benchmark I did was done on CPU-Z, and here we just takes a second to look at the results. In other words, wow, this is incredible. So according to CPU-Z, 64-bit Windows has close to double the score of 32-bit Windows in terms of single 30 performance. But don't worry guys, it gets even better, because in multi-threaded performance, 664-bit Windows gets almost 4 times the score of 32-bit Windows. This is absolutely insane. When I look back at these numbers, at first I didn't think anything of it, but looking at the scores side by side, I'm honestly blown away. Like, serious nicely, these numbers are ridiculous. And last benchmark I wanted to do was 3D Mark Vantage to test the GPU performance. An older version of 3D Mark, yes, but for this hardware, it works fine. So what are the results? Well, it wasn't as crazy as CPU-Z 64-bit Windows, which was ahead by 70 points in the CPU. Maybe the ridiculous difference in speed was there in CPU-Z because Chrome was open in the background in 32-bit by accident, but I really doubt that. Anyway, for GPU performance, 32-bit Windows was ahead in this regard, but only by 12 points. So I don't really think this means anything in the real world, at least for the GPU. Okay, so the verdict here is basically this: don't ever get a 32-bit version of Windows, just don't ever. It'll only win in storage GPU, which wasn't even that big of a difference, and RAM-wise, and even with the RAM, I didn't even consider the 4GB cap that 32-bit Windows has. 64-bit Windows consistently kept winning in every test I threw at it. No matter what, unless you consider the ones I just mentioned for 32-bit, unless you so badly need 16-bit program compatibility. If you don't even know what that is, or you are an extremely low-end hardware, don't ever get the 32-bit version of Windows. If you find this review useful, like and subscribe for more updates. Have a great day. You're awesome.